It's no exaggeration to say that 2025 was a watershed year for the Middle East. Israel and Hamas have agreed to a mostly lasting ceasefire. Iran had its nuclear facilities bombed, and we got a year to look at what the new post-Assad Syria looks like. What does this mean for us going into 2026? Well, Gerald Flurry, the editor-in-chief of the Philadelphia Trumpet, had a lot to say about the Middle East over the course of last year. We'll do a deep dive into his 2025 coverage on this critical region and further extrapolate what it means for us now on today's Trumpet World.
My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That's what I want to be, a peacemaker and a unifier. I'm pleased to say that as of yesterday, one day before I assumed office, the hostages in the Middle East are coming back home to their families.
I think anything can be solved with dialogue, by clearing up misconception and miscommunication and disconnects between people. I believe that, by the way. And yet, the president is a president who doesn't want to go to war. And he'll use military action to stop a war. That's when he actually wants to use military action. In this particular case, hopefully it won't be necessary. Hopefully we can do it at the negotiating table.
I hope for our sake you wind up in Tehran.
Around 1,500 people killed in just 72 hours. This is what we uncovered in Syria. It happened in March along Syria's coast. Hundreds of Alawites, members of Assad's religious minority, were massacred.
We struck at the heart of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. We struck at the heart of Iran's nuclear weaponization program. We targeted Iran's main enrichment facility in Natanz. We targeted Iran's leading nuclear scientists working on the Iranian bomb. We also struck at the heart of Iran's ballistic missile program.
I'm starting because you're in my country, so I want to welcome you, Mr. President. And as soon as I found out that he's coming to refuel, I said, I'm not going to allow him to take off unless I come and say hello to him. So thank you very much, Mr. President, and it's always great seeing you.
What if we decided to change it up? What if we decided to get a new closest ally in the world? How about Qatar? What if Qatar was our closest ally?
Has President Trump raised with you, discussed with you, your own past affiliation with al-Qaeda terrorism?
I
think this is a matter of the past. Now, we did not discuss this actively.
That was a little sample of everything that went on this past year in the Middle East. Welcome back to Trumpet World. I'm Mihailo Zekic, subbing in for your regular host, Richard Palmer. Now, you go back to January 1st, 2025, and look at what the Middle East was like then, and look at it now, and you could see that this is really a region transformed, maybe more so than other parts of the world. So much has changed. It looks like a completely different arena from this time last year. How do you make sense of everything going on in the Middle East? All these complicated countries interacting with each other, fighting wars with each other. Well, before we do that, let's review one biblical prophecy that we go to on this program quite often. And regarding Mr. Flurry's coverage, I think it does a good job setting the frame for what Mr. Flurry had to say of most of these events in the Middle East. This is a prophecy in the book of Psalms, the 83rd Psalm. It starts, "Keep not you silence, O God. Hold not your peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, your enemies make a tumult, and they that hate you have lifted up the head." So what's in this psalm is something God wants proclaimed. He does not want his people to keep silence about. Who are these enemies? Well, verses 6 through 8 read, "The tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites, of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre, Asher also is joined with them. Now, that's a list of various biblical peoples that throughout ancient Israel's history have had differing relations, fought different wars with them, but whether you look through the Bible or whether you look through secular history, we've never seen this alliance come together like this. We've never seen all these people come together in this one grand alliance. Verse 4 says that they come together for this, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. That purpose for an alliance isn't recorded in the Bible either. That's because it hasn't happened yet. For decades, Mr. Flurry has pointed to this being a prophecy for now. But who are these peoples today? Well, this is what we write in our relevant trends article on thetrumpet.com. Quote, many of these ancient names refer to nations that still exist in the same territory. Moab and Ammon both refer to Jordan. The Philistines refers to the displaced Palestinian Arabs. Tyre is Lebanon. Ishmaelites is the prophetic term for the Arabs of modern Saudi Arabia. Other identities such as Asher and Edom can be proved through other research. Edom is modern Turkey. Asher refers to Germany. End quote. And we have literature explaining that there are other countries that may fall under these umbrellas. The Ishmaelites, you could expand to the peninsular Arabs, including the Gulf states, as well as Saudi Arabia. And the one country that's not in the region today listed here is Germany, which for long-time followers of our program know we expect Germany to rise as a superpower in Europe, leading 10 nations guided by the Catholic Church. So this is speaking of an alliance between these Arab peoples and Germany for the purpose that the name of Israel would be no more in remembrance, to attack the peoples of Israel. So with this foundation, understanding the Middle East becomes much clearer. And through his coverage of the past year, Mr. Flurry references this prophecy quite a few times. Most of his coverage, in fact, revolves around it. So let's start with one of the biggest changes to recently hit in the Middle East would be Lebanon. On January 9th, Lebanon received a new president. From 2022 to that point, the presidency has been vacant because of problems caused by Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terror group that controls much of Lebanon. But an anti-Hezbollah president, Joseph Aoun, was able to take power, and he appointed a new prime minister that was also against Hezbollah. Leading up to this, Israel fought a war with Hezbollah, destroyed much of its infrastructure, killed many of its soldiers, many of its terrorists, and the group was sufficiently weakened for this to happen. When that war was concluded, it looked like Hezbollah was finally out of Lebanon, which meant really Iran was out of Lebanon. And this is where we start with our coverage for Mr. Flurry's analysis from last year and the January 2025 print edition of the Trumpet. Technically, he wrote this based off of events that happened before January, but it still applies for this year. This article is called The Fall and Rise of Lebanon. And he writes in there, for years, I have said, based on Bible prophecy, that this break between Iran and Lebanon would occur. For example, in our October 2020 Trumpet, I wrote that Hezbollah will forfeit much of its power and Iran will lose its grip over Lebanon. This is happening before our eyes. Hezbollah is an evil terrorist group. The breaking of its power is an exciting fulfillment of prophecy, end quote. Now, as I mentioned, in Psalm 83, you have Tyre in there. Tyre is still a city in Lebanon. It's actually one of Hezbollah's strongholds. It's near the border with Israel. The prophecy also mentions Gebal, or Byblos, as mentioned in some ancient texts. That's still a city in Lebanon today in the north. And based on that prophecy and other prophecies like in Daniel 11, which talk about Iran going against Europe, going against Germany, being against what Germany is doing in the Middle East, and Mr. Flurry's book, The King of the South, can explain more of that. Mr. Flurry predicted that Lebanon's not going to be allied with Iran. Something is going to cause that break. And near the start of last year, that break had started. Mr. Flurry continued, quoting from an older article he wrote, but it's still in the January 2025 article, quote, Lebanon is the only Middle Eastern country with a strong Christian population. I wrote a decade ago in an article about this alliance. 40% of Lebanon's population belongs to a Christian denomination. The largest is the Catholic-affiliated Maronite Church. By constitutional decree, the president of Lebanon must be a Maronite. This heavily Christian population makes Lebanon different from the rest of the Arab world. Because of its high population of Christian Arabs, Lebanon has become a linchpin for the Psalm 83 alliance. Mr. Flurry, in the 2025 article, then summarizes this large Christian population means it is of deep interest to the Vatican. End quote. And throughout the article, you can read Mr. Flurry puts heavy emphasis on the Vatican's interest in Lebanon and all the events that are happening there. The subheads include the Vatican's view, the Vatican's power play. The emphasis is on the Vatican. And you look at what happened just in November. Pope Leo visited Lebanon less than a year after becoming the new pope. It was during his first trip abroad. He technically stopped off in Turkey first, but Lebanon was the first traditionally Catholic land he visited in his pontificate. If you look back with his predecessors, Pope Benedict, it took years for him to visit Lebanon, and Pope Francis never visited Lebanon. But for Pope Leo, what's going on in Lebanon is such a huge priority that he made it part of his first trip abroad, his first Catholic land that he visited. And when he gave an address in Beirut, he talked about the theme of his visit was Blessed are the Peacemakers, that he came there to encourage the peace process. He is deeply interested in the peace process and in supporting it. In other words, in removing Hezbollah from power. He met with survivors of the Beirut blast explosion in 2020, something Hezbollah caused but was never brought to justice for. So you could see that about a year after Mr. Flurry wrote this article, what he was saying about the Vatican going into Lebanon, it was happening. And it's still happening right now. Now, Lebanon's problems aren't over. Hezbollah has been able to rearm, and the government said that they disarmed Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is still there. Israel's still very concerned what's going on there. Doesn't look like the story is finished there, but keep watching what happens with Lebanon and what happens with the Vatican working with Lebanon. So that was in our January edition. Our February print edition was a special report covering the recent fall of the regime of Bashar Assad in Syria. That happened in December. We do work on these editions ahead of time based off of when we expect them to enter into people's mailboxes. But even though it was based off of events from the previous year, what Mr. Flurry wrote in his cover article still applies for everything that followed. So some recap on December 7th and 8th, Syrian rebels led by the group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, an affiliate of al-Qaeda, ousted Assad. Assad fled to Russia, and this new group, HTS, took over the government with Turkey's backing and some of Turkey's other proxy forces in the region. So this is what Mr. Flurry wrote in the February edition in an article called Syria's Fall, Another Key Prophecy Fulfilled. Another key prophecy fulfilled. We mentioned earlier about Gebel and Tyre being part of this alliance, modern Lebanon. If you look at the biblical history, there's a group of people called the Hagarenes, also known as the Hagarites, that lived in what is today Syria. And based off of that prophecy, Mr. Flurry said that Syria is going to be a part of this group as well. Even though, like Hezbollah, Syria was an ally of Iran. But today, that has completely changed. Mr. Flurry wrote, quote, virtually overnight, Syrian dictator Bashar Assad's government has been toppled. Russia and Iran are shocked. The whole world has been astonished. Rebels were able to do in 13 days what they had not been able to do in more than 13 years. Nobody expected this. Assad looked weak some years ago, but in recent years it looked like he had weathered the storm and was quite strong. Listen to the commentators and you see that they were blindsided by this sudden fall. And then Mr. Flurry emphasizes, but Trumpet readers were not blindsided. The Bible prophesied this drastic change in Syria, and we have been saying for years that this would happen. End quote. Then he references an article he wrote back in 2012. That's when the Syrian civil war was only just starting. And he wrote then, right now Syria is Iran's most important regional ally, but that is about to change. Biblical prophecy reveals that very soon Syria will no longer align with Iran. It also shows that Germany will help cause the split. Now, we don't always know the timing of all of these events. Mr. Flurry brings that out in his latest article, but he still stood by his prediction that Syria would leave Iran's orbit and get closer to Germany. How has that played out with the recent events in Syria? Well, Turkey sponsored the rebels, and Turkey was sponsored by Germany. Right before the rebels' lightning offensive, Germany resumed major arms exports to Turkey. Germany supplies parts to Turkey's famous Bayraktar drones, which the rebels used extensively. And Mr. Flurry goes on in that article to show that Germany really, through backing Turkey, was the cause of Assad leaving. Now, Assad was a very brutal man. He was an ally of Iran. He gassed his own people with chemical weapons. You might think, okay, it's good that he's gone. Maybe this new government will be a bit more normal. But Mr. Flurry writes in his February article, quote, prophecy does not indicate that this would be good news for the modern-day Jews in Israel. In fact, the opposite is the case. And you think about, again, this group, which we've covered on this program many times before. We had a special program about this right when Syria was falling, or Assad's Syria was falling. The current leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, he used to have a bounty on his head by the State Department. His group, again, is an al-Qaeda affiliate. They may have formally cut ties because they felt that associating with al-Qaeda obviously is not doing them any favors with getting foreign sponsorship. But a jihadist in a suit is still a jihadist. And where have Syria gone since then? We've had in March massacres against the Alawites, a religious minority in Syria. After that, there was a massacre against the Druze, another religious minority. Israel got involved and even fired made strikes at Syria's capital in Damascus. You've had foreign fighters from places like Xinjiang in China and the rest of the Muslim world be grafted into the Syrian military. Sharaa said that they were going to leave originally, or at least that was the starting point of negotiations, and instead he grafted these people who aren't even Syrian, who the only reason they came to Syria was to spread international jihad into his government. They're still causing fights with the Kurds and made significant gains against them. Syria is turning into an al-Qaeda state right now. And the United States, and we'll get to this a bit later in more detail, the United States is actually encouraging this process. Sharaa used to have a bounty on his head. His group used to be subject to international sanctions. President Donald Trump removed all those. He invited Sharaa to the White House, the first Syrian state to ever be in the White House in November. And he is pressuring Israel to make deals with Syria to normalize relations, even though this guy that's leading Syria is also leading the heir to the group that put 2 planes into the Twin Towers on 9/11. But this is not the only influence in the Middle East the United States has that is using to change these events. Going into the actual events of this past year when everything started, on January 15th, 2025, we've had a lot to say recently about the significance of January 16th and events that happened then. We'll have a special edition of the Week in Review program later this week on that. But on January 15th of last year, we got a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, brokered by the United States. President Trump liked to claim credit for that, and He definitely had a huge role to play, but he wasn't even actually in office yet. The ceasefire that was crafted, it was crafted by Joe Biden's people and was basically adopted by President Trump and some of his people, like Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, to pressure Israel to sign an agreement with Hamas to let Hamas live in exchange for hostages coming back. That's obviously a good thing, but Israel also released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners as a result. And the message from the Trump administration was that, well, we don't want total defeat of Hamas. We see you, Israel, as the more pliable party in this conflict. If we want to end this war, you're going to have to let Hamas live. And Mr. Flurry, in our March print edition, wrote an article called President Trump Betrayed Israel, which goes into detail on just how bad of a ceasefire this was, not just for Israel, but what it means for America. We covered this article in our previous episode, 2025, the year our message to America changed. You could look at that in more detail. But we can look at this from the perspective of the Middle East rather than the United States. This is what Mr. Flurry wrote, quote, Israelis had weathered the storms of a hostile Biden administration and were anticipating President Trump being far more favorable. But this deal is hardly more favorable than what Biden's team would have offered. Later down, this deal has exposed Mr. Trump's flaws in a way that none of us want to see. Something is dreadfully wrong here. What Mr. Trump has done here is going to plague him for the rest of his tenure in office. Just watch and see if it doesn't happen that way unless he dramatically changes course. End quote. Now that might sound a little bit extreme, as Mr. Palmer and our U.S. correspondent Andrew Miller described in the previous episode. God is invested in the Trump presidency, but he is also invested in the state of Israel. This isn't just a betrayal of a random nation that has no history with God. Mr. Flurry has a chapter in his newly updated book, The Key of David. It's called How God Uses the Jews. You could look at that chapter to show what the Jewish nation today means to God and why it's relevant for Christians today. But that went out in the March issue. What has happened since then? Well, each ceasefire President Trump has pressured Israel to take has followed on to the pattern of that original one that he made, where Israel releases Palestinian prisoners, agrees to let Hamas live in exchange for hostages coming out. This includes the lasting ceasefire, quote unquote, that Israel and Hamas agreed to in October. And to this point, Hamas still hasn't disarmed, has given no timetable on when it plans to disarm. And even with this recent news, which we'll get to a bit later in the program, with this new Board of Peace President Trump is sponsoring, you have troops from Muslim countries that sponsor Hamas, that are hostile to Israel, being invited to settle in Gaza without Israel's consent. Now, there have been some moments of President Trump cooperating more with Israel, like the Iran strikes, which we'll get to soon. President Trump could have gone further than that. He pressured Israel again to stand down and not keep fighting in Iran. But in general, I think it's safe to say President Trump has not dramatically changed course from what Mr. Flurry wrote about in that article. If memory serves me right, I think President Trump gave Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu permission to go all in Gaza and finish Hamas once and for all. I think he gave permission about 4 times after Hamas started being difficult in ceasefire negotiations. And Israel never followed through, and the only reason they wouldn't have followed through would be if they knew that that was just more bluster from Trump's side and he didn't actually mean it, and there was pressure from the Americans not to do that. Now, when President Trump was campaigning, he was campaigning to be a president of peace, to solve the world's conflicts. This is the first one that he supposedly solved. I mean, look at the success he's had since then. He's claimed to wanted to finish the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. It's been over a year later, and nothing's changed. He's brokered agreements between the Congo and Rwanda, between Thailand and Cambodia, and those peace deals fell apart almost as soon as they were signed. He didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize for all these endeavors, and he openly claimed to in retaliation for that to annex territory from Denmark and Greenland. Another one of Mr. Flurry's articles from this past year, Does Donald Trump Know the Way to Peace?, explains that, and we focused on that in the previous episode. But in at least this sense, you could see the enemies of America look and say, okay, President Trump's a pushover. If we just hold our ground and we keep doing what we're doing, he's not going to force us to back down. And that is a good segue into the next issue that Mr. Flurry touched on from the Middle East. In May, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced that the U.S. government was accepting a $400 million luxury plane from the nation of Qatar on the Persian Gulf to be used as President Trump's new Air Force One. It's been described as a flying palace, and it's going to be gifted to the Trump Presidential Library after the term ends. The president received a lot of criticism from this because it looks a lot like a bribe. Qatar is Hamas's sponsor. They have a stake in what's going on there too. Hamas has its HQ in Doha, Qatar's capital. Al Jazeera, the state-controlled news media in Qatar, they have people on the ground in Gaza that are either members of Hamas or either helping Hamas do what they're doing. And it's not just Hamas. Qatar also has a history of sponsoring groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They sponsored HTS, the group that's now in control in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood, the group that used to have control in Egypt, they have their headquarters there as well. Basically, every major Sunni group you could think of, one way or another, has ties to Qatar. And Mr. Flurry had a lot to say about that in an article from our July 2025 print edition called Don't Accept Gifts from Terrorists. And again, Mr. Palmer and Andrew went through that article in the episode they filmed about the United States, but we could still touch on it here. This is what Mr. Flurry wrote. Quote, "Do you think the Qatari leaders offered President Trump that jet because they love him? They are flattering him." Further down, why is President Trump cozying up to them? It seems he is now negotiating with anyone. In many ways, he is caving in. He continued, "This is evil. And once you open yourself up to evil, it leads to worse and worse things. Bible prophecy shows specifically what is coming." End quote. And we have seen this influence from Qatar be negative to the United States, not just in, say, giving Hamas a lifeline, giving somebody that has Trump's ear now that's speaking on behalf of Hamas, but Qatar is also by far the biggest donator to U.S. educational institutions, universities, like the ones we've been seeing all those pro-Hamas riots happening, places like Colombia, etc. There's connections there with all that unrest happening in the States. And it's not just President Trump that they're flattering. Many of Trump's inner circle have accepted money from Qatar, or even used to work for Qatar as Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, Steve Witkoff, the peace negotiator in the Middle East. Those are some of the biggest ones, but by far not the only ones. And we had a companion piece in that print edition to Mr. Flurry's article called In Qatar's Pocket that explains some of those links. And since then, I always think this is interesting. Mr. Flurry will have something in the Trumpet that talks about a trend maybe not many people are paying attention to. I don't think many Americans had Qatar on their radar before this. And since then, you've seen a slew of right-wing people come in and openly defend Qatar. We played the Tucker Carlson clip in the montage earlier. Mr. Flurry often is ahead of his time. One of the slogans we use in the Trumpet is "You heard it here first." But going back to Psalm 83, another group mentioned was the Ishmaelites, and the big fish in that group is Saudi Arabia. But as we've discussed, that also includes Gulf states like Qatar, where each of these individual countries, there's a number of different countries clustered on there, are going to fall. If they're all part of Psalm 83, or if some of them might align with Iran, we don't necessarily know the exact specifics. But either way, it's the same spirit that the Psalm 83 alliance is forming around. Verse 4, to blot out the name of Israel. In this case, Qatar is already trying very hard and very surreptitiously to get that done. Well, moving on, in June, in this case, you saw Israel go on the offensive. Israel struck Iran's nuclear program at Natanz, Iraq, Fordo. Over a week later, the U.S. dropped bunker busters on Fordo, this really deep underground facility which you needed bunker busters to properly penetrate. Prime Minister Netanyahu called the action Operation Rising Lion, based off of Numbers 23-24, which talks about the children of Israel rising like lions. And in our August issue, again, we write these ahead of time, Mr. Flurry had an article called Netanyahu, Israel's Rising Lion. And he wrote in that, quote, "I was stirred by Netanyahu's action and his bold, aggressive leadership. In many ways, he is his nation's rising lion. What Israel did to neutralize Iran teaches all mankind powerful lessons about what it takes to overcome evil. And it is a specific reminder to those God has called to back his watchman work in this dangerous end time. To achieve what God wants us to, we all need the spirit of a rising lion," end quote. Now, in the article, he compares Netanyahu to Winston Churchill and a prophecy in Ezekiel 33, the first 6 verses, which speak of a watchman chosen by the people to warn when the sword's coming. Mr. Flurry has pointed to this being fulfilled by Winston Churchill right before World War II. You could read more about that in our booklet, Winston S. Churchill, The Watchman. But in his article, Mr. Flurry said that Netanyahu has the same spirit that Churchill has. The same spirit described in Ezekiel. He writes, quote, "I believe that just as God used the courage of Churchill to save Western civilization, God has used the fighting spirit of Netanyahu to hold off the atomic forces of evil," end quote. And you can look in Revelation 5. Jesus Christ is described as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Jesus Christ has this lion-like spirit that he wants his people to have. Further down, "The people doing God's work today must understand this deeply. Our leader is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is strong, he is fearless, and this lion must live within us." Continuing, "We have to be like that lion to serve God and carry on his work. We must be as bold as a lion. The lion turns away from nothing. It never retreats." And he cites Proverbs 28, verse 1, and Proverbs 30, verse 30 about that. So this is a little break from the theme we've had thus far. In this case, something positive that Mr. Flurry focuses on. And he focuses on it because it's a good example for us. It's a good example for true Christians spiritually on how to confront evil, as he said. And it shows that events happening with physical Israel are not this separate little thing that God wants his people to just be passive observers on. If you look at 1 Corinthians 10:11, and it mentions the history of the people of Israel is for New Testament Christians to look at, to examine, to learn lessons from. And even with the Jews today, the principle, in somewhat at least, still applies. Moving on August 8th, President Trump brokered another one of his peace deals, this time between Armenia and Azerbaijan, two former Soviet countries that have a long history of fighting. Maybe some people would dispute that being in the Middle East. Most Azeris live in Iran. I think it's fair game. But part of this peace treaty included the so-called Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, or TRIP. This port that would run from Azerbaijan and their ports on the Caspian Sea, their ports connected to Central Asia, through Armenia to Turkey, and from Turkey to the rest of Europe. And the U.S. would be overseeing its construction, would be allowing private American contractors to help economically develop the corridor and potentially even include soldiers' boots on the ground. But Turkey, as I mentioned, is one of the guarantors of this agreement. In fact, it is really what's getting this agreement going. And this TRIP pact, if fully implemented, will boost Turkey's power in a massive way. Turkey's never really had this kind of influence, even historically, when it was the Ottoman Empire in this part of the world. We have an article in our October edition called "Is TRIP a Trap?" that looks through some of the nuances of this agreement and what it means for the region and for America. But that was a companion piece to an article Mr. Flurry had in that edition. It's going to be the last one we touch on, called "Turkey is Going to Betray America." Now that's a bold statement. It's not just through TRIP that America is cooperating with Turkey. America even lends Turkey nuclear bombs on its own soil and has done so for decades. It's led by a strongman president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is an Islamist. Mr. Flurry writes in that article, quote, Erdogan accuses Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. He hates the Jewish state so much he wants to see it blotted out. He has publicly prayed for Allah to destroy Israel. His government has stoked anti-Israel sentiment domestically with state-controlled media campaigns. He has worked to rally the Muslim world against Israel, hosting summits and pushing for boycotts. Erdogan has wished mercy on the martyrs, quote-unquote, of Hamas. He provides safe haven and Turkish citizenship to Hamas operatives, whom he praises as freedom fighters. Further down, despite all that, America and Britain view Turkey as an ally. They really ought to consider what God thinks. And through the rest of the article, Mr. Flurry talks about a prophecy in the book of Obadiah, talking about Edom. Another one of these peoples mentioned in Psalm 83. These people that is the modern Turkish nation today. Obadiah 10 says, for your violence, speaking to Edom, for your violence against your brother Jacob, shame will cover you. Verse 14, neither should you have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape, neither should you have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. Now, Jacob refers to the name of the patriarch Israel before he was converted. It refers to the Jews in the Middle East today, but it also refers to America, as our free book, The United States and Britain Prophecy, elaborates. Turkey is at the crossroads of the world. They control the Dardanelles. They control the land bridge between Europe and Asia. There's some really strategic territory there. And Mr. Flurry writes in his article, quote, this is describing Jacobite refugees coming through those sea gates at the crossroads of the world and the Turks killing them and delivering them up to the Germans. God takes that personally. So according to Obadiah, according to Psalm 83, we can expect Turkey to play a really crucial role in this alliance as well. And President Trump is helping them become more powerful, helping them, setting the stage for this coming betrayal. Well, that summarizes Mr. Flurry's coverage of the Middle East. What does this have to do with today? We've had some comments recently that we keep focusing on 2025 year in review on the Trumpet world. Why can't we talk about things that are more recent? Well, this has everything to do with what we're seeing today in the Middle East. This is what the Trumpet Morning Letter was on January 19th, this year of 2026, by our managing editor, Joel Hilliker, entitled, Did January 16th Mark the End of the U.S.-Israel Relationship? If you remember back in Mr. Flurry's article, that was tied with the U.S. and Israel doing things January 16th last year, coming full circle to January 16th this year. This is what Mr. Hilliker wrote. Quote, the diplomatic rift between the two countries began to widen last Wednesday when U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff overrode Israeli objections and officially declared the start of Phase 2 of the Gaza peace plan. Further down, then on January 16th, the White House named an executive board for Gaza, a 15-member committee to oversee transitional governance and reconstruction. The board included Turkey's foreign minister, a close confidant of Erdogan, and a senior Qatari official. These are two nations that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has insisted should play no role in governing Gaza. Meanwhile, the board included an Israeli businessman but no Israeli government officials. Mr. Hilliker concludes, this was a sharp slap in Israel's face. The next day, Mr. Netanyahu's press office sent out a statement. I'll read that now. The announcement regarding the composition of the Gaza Executive Board, which is subordinate to the Board of Peace, was not coordinated with Israel and runs contrary to its policy. The Prime Minister has instructed the Foreign Affairs Minister to contact the U.S. Secretary of State on this matter, end quote. This is pretty blunt. This is criticism that you generally didn't even see from Netanyahu when Obama and Biden were in power. And he's sending this kind of criticism out to Trump. Man, he's called Israel's best friend ever in the White House. Involving all these nations we've talked about, Qatar, Turkey. We showed a video clip earlier about Tucker Carlson talking about how Qatar should be America's #1 ally. We won't show the whole video. He ignores a lot, like how much Qatar sponsors terrorism, how they have slave labor and building all those shiny buildings he talks about. He says there's no Qatar lobby and then says Qatar invests a tremendous amount in the U.S. I guess investing is only a lobby when it's a country he doesn't like. But here's a spliced clip summarizing the point he is making from that video.
What if we decided to change it up? What if we decided to get a new closest ally in the world? How about Qatar? What if Qatar was our closest ally? Float that one at the next dinner party you go to. People will respond strongly, especially if they're Fox News viewers. What? Are you an Islamist? Qatar? The bloodthirsty Islamo-fascist state? What, are you getting paid by the Qatar lobby? So why are they telling me that? They're telling me that because the status quo works for Israel. It works. So if there's any other country that might displace it, with whom we might form a stronger or as strong alliance, if there's a rival for that loyalty, it's a massive threat to them. And by the way, I understand that. This is a tiny country involved in a lot of conflicts that has basically no real allies other than the United States. So I hate to use the word because it's overused, but this is existential for Israel. This is a huge deal for them. It's not just a matter of preference. This is like a lifeline. And so you get it. You absolutely get it. But at some point, our interests, the interests of the country of 350 million, do have to play a role in this calculation. And by that measure, this is not a good deal for the United States.
But the point he makes is still one that, in that video, is still one many people hold on to in America, including those in the Trump administration. And you're seeing that play out with all the events we've just talked about and with what's happening on the ground in the Middle East right now. You're seeing a shift from the U.S. government supporting Israel in its wars on terror to supporting a lot of the countries Israel is warring against. Maybe they have some more money to throw at the U.S. than Israel does. Maybe they have some shiny toys to do so. But these countries come with a lot of baggage. So if you want to summarize the big themes of geopolitics in the Middle East in 2025, based off of Mr. Flurry's coverage, is that we're really seeing a big shift from the United States away from Israel and towards building the Psalm 83 alliance. This is already having a massive impact on events right now at the start of the year, and you can be sure it's going to continue having a massive impact. And this doesn't just impact the state of Israel. Remember verse 4, they're talking about that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. As I mentioned, the name of Israel is also on America. They want America blotted out. They want people to forget everything about the legacy of America. You think about governments like the one in Syria, based off of Al-Qaeda. Nobody joins Al-Qaeda because they didn't like what they saw in 9/11, because they don't want to see more 9/11s. Now, Israel is standing against this, and to be fair, there are still some places Israel and the U.S. cooperate, like with Iran, and where Israel can get away with it, like with Iran's nuclear program, they're going to push as hard as they can. But they can only play this game for so long before a serious rift happens that is not going to be fixed. That's about all we have time for right now. I want to thank Mr. Richard Palmer for letting me sub for you today. Thank Matthew Friesen and Victor Granados for engineering and production. And thank you again to the viewer for tuning in. We'll be back on Friday with our regular weekend review program with a special January 16th program. You've probably noticed we mentioned that date quite a lot in this program. We'll go into more detail on why that one's important coming up. And until then, keep watching your world.